Hopefully you found those three videos about the small towns straddling the border between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan interesting, as well as the more recent update from the third video. I think this is a fascinating region for a bunch of different reasons, not least of which because this was along one of those Silk Road routes between two areas of ancient historical importance between China, the Ottoman Empire, and the Mediterranean, and because of the crucial role that this area played from the Great Game between the British and Russian empires in the 19th century to the Soviet Union efforts to try to solidify control over these areas of relatively new spheres of influence, to the importance of the area in the years after 9/11, in which a lot of the battles that were fought in Afghanistan and the cross-border rebel groups that had been fighting the Taliban even before 9/11, how a lot of those people came from some of these neighboring areas. As the video mentioned, some of the people in Guantanamo Bay came from those small villages, as well as the strategic importance it played for the United States' ability to base aircraft in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek, to resupply on the way to go to Afghanistan, and as well as to the resources that these areas produce. So it's a fascinating area. I'm just going to try to cover a few elements from it, but to hint at a much larger truth for your own papers or for your own research, that there are these kind of idiosyncratic and often overlooked parts of the world that can play a crucial role in both major power issues as well as individual level struggles for human development and for a better life that they're willing to take up arms for it. Before I do that, I thought, I'm not trying to spring the third lecture question on you, but I wanted to get your feedback on the Tajik and Kyrgyz videos specifically, because I think when rewatching them, I'm sorry for the bad video quality. These are the best quality videos that I could find. I want you to think about the the efforts to try to make these people lives sustainable to the point that there are incentives to stay and to not to move to try to seek a better job in Moscow or elsewhere, that to have long-term stability in farming, you need to be able to have a dependent source of water, as well as just to be able to survive, right? So for those Kyrgyz wells that received international assistance, as well as domestic efforts to try to make them sustainable, do you think those wells would be more likely to be maintained by more institutional spending and support, right? A more centralized or top-down approach, or should money and effort be spent on public information campaigns, right, as you saw in the video, describing who the water belongs to, and provide individuals who actually live in those communities an incentive and an understanding about who the resources belong to, and therefore who takes responsibility for it, right? Because it's one thing to have these things created, it's a completely different thing to maintain them and keep them going. So I'd be interested to see whether your take on these kind of issues, do you see more of an argument for a top-down, centralized approach, or an effort to try to create bottom-up ownership of this? So please leave your questions in, and then let's come back and start talking about a couple of really fascinating parts of Central Asia and a couple of bits from the history. Okay, welcome back. So for me, I've this has been an enduring area of fascination. It's one of the places I read Peter Hopkirk's Great Game when I was back in college before I had been anywhere and seen anything, and I always wanted to go to this region. And it was a region of Soviet and British spies and diplomacy and intrigue that overlooked a lot of the people who actually lived on the land and were actually trying to survive on it. And it also combines my fascination with mountainous places. So, Peak Lenin is there, some absolutely gorgeous territory, and some absolutely amazing culture. Some of my research on human trafficking has sadly involved some research on this region. We're going to get into cotton production in a second, but one of the largest challenges in understanding and preventing forced labor is not bottom up forced labor, but state sanctioned forced labor in Uzbekistan. Every year there's such a large cotton production that there isn't enough people to actually pick it. And so the last time I heard this is still going on, they have people who derive their income from the state, like teachers like me, would be forced to go out and help harvest the cotton production every year. So you have one of the largest problems with forced labor in the area, as well as forced marriage. Doesn't get as much attention as other types of human trafficking or modern slavery, but in Kyrgyzstan, there is a traditional practice of men abducting women and making them their wives. So forced marriage is still a challenge. Government's efforts to try to prevent it. But yeah, there's ongoing issues. And in the post-Soviet era, there's been a lot of efforts at trying to create success and relative stability in transitioning from long-serving leaders to other long-serving leaders, as well as the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan and peoples trying to fight for more representation. Basically, a long way of saying that this is an area of potential conflict for natural resources. And Central Asia, because of its history and its geography, is an area of ongoing risk. This is a map of, you can see Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, as well as China to the east, Iran to the south, Azerbaijan is across the lake, Kazakhstan up in the north. But you see, it doesn't really show that there, but this is another kind of way of trying to draw the borders in red there that makes it a bit clearer how these borders are so complex and intertwined. And it's a lot of the challenges specifically related to water relate to the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya catchments, the rivers that originate quite high in the mountains. You can see in the orange colors in Tajikistan as well as Kyrgyzstan and Afghanistan. The waters flow downhill largely to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, though also into Turkmenistan as well, and that have traditionally flowed into the Aral Sea, something that we're going to be talking about a bit in a second. But what you see is, while the borders of the states might be complex, these two river systems are quite straightforward, and that they create this kind of O shape. And this is another way of looking at those borders with Kyrgyzstan at the center, and it shows how drawing borders have long-term historical impacts. You might be more familiar with Mountbatten going to India and the efforts to try to draw the weekend to draw the line between what became Pakistan and India, or the lines drawn in Africa after the Berlin Conference in 1884. But in the Soviet times, the lines were drawn in Central Asia that had crucial impacts as well. So, an area that had been the control of Mongol Empire, the Soviet Union, once the Soviet Union solidified control after the revolution of 1917, Stalin solidified control and tried to maintain that control by dividing areas that could be potentially problematic. So Stalin drew the borders in the Fergana Valley between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and the other countries in the region in a way that would divide ethnic and traditional groups into two different countries, so that there would be less of an opportunity for these states that were part of the Union of Soviet Republics, but that they would be less likely to be able to organize to be able to oppose them. After the end of the Cold War, these countries quickly declared independence. By and large, every single Soviet-era leader that was in power at the end of the Soviet Union maintained power. Turkmenbashi, which we're going to look at in a second, stayed in power until 2006. Kazakhstan, there's been a gradual turnover of power. Uzbekistan, just because of the leaders getting old and the nature of human lifespans. But there has been, by and large, leadership consistency in a number of these states. And there was a quite quick effort to try to negotiate water distribution agreements after the end of the Cold War, in an era that there had been more centralized control and allocation during the Soviet times. These newly independent countries had to reach quite quick agreements for how these resources would be allocated. In 1992, there was an Interstate Commission for Water Coordination, and there were definitely different interests between the different states, often depending on where they were, either upstream or downstream. Kyrgyzstan wanted to store water in the spring to autumn and reduce this water in the winter to spring for hydropower production, because that's when energy usage was the highest. So they wanted to store it and then use the power, generate the power and use it during the winter, while those downstream countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan wanted the water during the growing season from April until September. And so you had upstream and downstream trying to reach agreements. Eventually, one was signed in 1998 with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And then a year later, Tajikistan signed on. And this agreement set monthly water release targets from Toktogul Reservoir. That lake that I showed you in the beginning of this video, that is a picture of the Toktogul Reservoir. Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous part of the country. And Turkmenistan, which we're going to see in a second, gets about 36% of the outflow. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan roughly similar. So that's the Toktogul Reservoir. That and another lake that was actually in the east became like a Soviet era resort. Easy trains. When I was there 20 years ago, there were still people who were migrating from Tajikistan. There was a train line that went straight from the capital of Tajikistan all the way to Moscow. People going for a living to earn money. So there's the Toktogul Dam, and Lake Issyk on the northern side of Lake Issyk is where a lot of the resorts were still there. Soviet era monstrosities. And you can see right south of the Toktogul Dam is the fertile Fergana Valley that's split between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. And you can see the Osh and Jalalabad are on two sides of that border. We're going to come back to Osh in a second. But yeah, there's a train that goes directly from Dushanbe to Moscow. I wonder if it still goes. Actually, a beautiful old wooden train. I mentioned the monthly release targets for water from the Toktogul Reservoir. This is from 2012 article in Journal of Peace Research looking at the runoff from the Totko Reservoir in the upper right, and you can see how that kind of relates in a more less clear fashion with the water that goes into the Fergana Valley from other resources from other areas. And so you see mostly that release happening in the middle parts of the year, so that the downstream areas have enough water for economic production. Another thing that was also interesting, I mentioned cotton, was the fact that Stalin decreed that this was going to be an area that would specialize in cotton production. Cotton is an incredibly water intensive resource, and that was also part of the reason to try to divert a large amount of this water down to the lowlands in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. This area, the video was from 2009. A lot of things have actually happened since then in 2009 that shows the ongoing relevance of this area, and splitting people in villages and families across borders have long-term effects. There was low-level violence over land, a collective farm back in 1990. There's been other low-level clashes. One of the more dramatic ones was after the presidential election in 2010 in Osh and Jalalabad, as I said, right near the border. The president ended up fleeing office. A new one got voted into power in 2010, and a new one in 2015. So there has been changeover in power in Kyrgyzstan. These clashes between traditional ethnic Kyrgyz and Uzbeks ended up being quite costly in lives, killed about 420 people. The violence back in 1990 also killed a couple hundred people as well. A large number of people were displaced by it. The Uzbeks, which I believe have more resources than the Kyrgyz, sent troops over the border to help the Uzbek refugees flee the country. There's been a huge, since the end of the Soviet era, there has been migration from areas in the Russian language speakers. A lot of them did return to Russia in the aftermath, and there is a difference between people who speak Russian in these areas and the ones that speak Kyrgyz or Uzbek as well. So there's been cross-border challenges. There's been efforts to try to reach agreements for resources, and I think there's been a greater effort at trying to enforce these at the national level, and it can be harder to actually carry them out at the local level, right? Because of institutional limitations, as well as the Osh and Jalalabad area is quite distinct, and different groups of people living down in the south as opposed to people who live up the north in the capital in Bishkek. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan first. So this is a map of Uzbekistan that stretches out much farther to the west, leading to what is now looking like those two lungs, what was once the Aral Sea, and it stretches all the way inland to the Fergana Valley in the far east. But the vast majority of the country is low-lying, and it does depend on those water resources from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. I mentioned that Stalin said that this was going to be an area of cotton production. Even 30 years after the end of the Cold War, these historical legacies are still relevant. You saw the Cold War era infrastructure that still is crucial towards electrical production and hydroelectric production, but you can still see that Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan surround Australia in the top 10 cotton producers, even as of last year. India is the largest than US and China, but given the relatively different geographic size, water resources, it's really remarkable that you have Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan in this list. It still shows that legacy of economic production there, and it's absolutely wild to actually see it happen there. Now, I wanted to spend some time talking about the Aral Sea, and this is connecting back to what happened in California when you have water reallocation due to political interests, and how that can shape geography even on a satellite or from a Google map. Um, and the Aral Sea is one of the most crazy, sad, but in some ways optimistic stories now of the post Soviet era. The Aral Sea used to be one of the largest inland seas, became quite economically productive. There's a lot of fishing boat and activity there. But now in Monyak, it was a town I visited on the Uzbek side that used to be at the edge of the lake, but now it's just an endless, just flat area where the lake used to be. Poisonous dust storms are kicked up by strong winds across the dry and polluted seabed, multitude of chronic and acute illnesses amongst the few residents who've chosen to remain. I brought my own water and I cooked my own food because I was told that you shouldn't try to depend on the local produced resources. And I think the natural question is why? Why would you either choose to visit this kind of place? But then also, how did it actually get there? The answer to the first is because I like the kind of off the beaten track kind of places that show these hidden historical legacies. These are some of the abandoned fishing vessels in outside of Monyak and some of the locals' cows. But it is because this area was chosen for a couple of other reasons to be an area of strategic interest. And the reason why is also the reason why this area is one of the most inhospitable places in the world. There's all these, BuzzFeed kind of lists of the top 10 different areas or most popular things. This one is the top 9 most inhospitable places in the world. Starts with number 9 in Yakutsk in Russia, and it ends with Anthrax Island. I'm gonna murder the name of this. I apologize. Vozrozhdeniya Island, which kind of straddles that border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, because the Aral Sea also kind of spans that border. There's one road that I took in Kyrgyzstan that just getting across Kyrgyzstan, I had to drive through Kazakhstan for about 3 minutes. I don't know if that counts as actually visiting Kazakhstan, but yeah, these borders cross a lot of these kind of geographical features. So this Anthrax Island, what's so bad? It was during the Soviet era an area for biowarfare experiments. The whole area is currently contaminated with anthrax, smallpox, bubonic plague. It was created because it was so isolated from major population centers. It was an island in the middle of an inland sea, far away from everybody else. And so it was seen as an area that would be relatively easy to contain because it was surrounded by water. Of course, once that water was diverted to create to enable cotton production, then it became easier to transmit. Local rodents are thought to have picked up some of these strains. The laboratory was established in the aftermath of World War II. Over 1,500 people live there. It's currently uninhabited. I think there's some people on YouTube who have been there. I wouldn't recommend it. It was abandoned shortly after the end of the Cold War. But it was a legacy of that major power battle, the Soviets versus the West and the United States. But because of other policies the government instituted, it ended up creating long-term health issues in the region, and the divergence of the water for agricultural production. One last note, that a more hopeful note on the Aral Sea. In recent years, the water levels have actually increased in certain areas. Parts of those two lakes have started to come together, and some people have started to fish on the northern part of the lake. So there is some kind of hope that with effort and policies you can, and through a little weather luck, you can try to offset some of these things. But the long-term health impacts of the dispersion of some of this biowarfare is something that's going to be long-lasting. One last note, I mentioned Turkmenistan a couple of weeks ago. It is most notable for its gas production, but it also is one of the world's largest producers of cotton, and that's because of the water runoff that they have from the Amu Darya. The capital city is one of those kind of Soviet era capital cities, but one in which, in the subsequent years, the local government has changed to reflect the current leader's interests. This is one of the most notable. I don't know if we could install one of these in Australia. This is the Arch of Neutrality in Ashgabat, with a 12-meter tall statue of the Soviet and then post-Soviet leader of Turkmenistan, Saparbat Niyazov. I've showed you some videos of his successor, but that 12-meter tall statue on the top rotates with the sun, so he's always facing the sun. But it is an area that has you have that one population center and some people on the coast, but it really is an overall agricultural dependence for the majority of the population on these resources that are dependent on the water resources that start in other countries. So yeah, that is a quick mention of a couple of salient issues related to the Central Asian cases, water more generally. And the main motivating question, I think, for me is how can water affect conflict? And I think one of the conclusions that I've reached, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and in your papers and your research, is that like some of the other climate and environmental factors that we've looked at so far, that is a multi-stage process, and that the scarcity of water resources, like other resources, are important because of the way that they could exacerbate economic, human development, or security scarcity challenges that can end up leading to conflict later on, and that the accident of where the resources are or efforts to create dams to move it someplace else can lead to distributional impacts that can lead to conflict. How it comes and goes is changing over time. There's been regulation in the Toktukul Dam that can make it relatively predictable month to month how much water is being released. But in other areas, like the glaciers retreating from mountainous areas around the world, is making water less predictable, as well as with some of the monsoons or storms becoming more abundant, can lead to issues from India to the Mekong Delta to a bunch of other places around the world. And how it's being used, Los Angeles and Las Vegas would be examples from my past, but you can think of a lot of examples for water usage as the Australian population grows, with other more water-intensive resources being used, that can create security issues, but also some incentives to cooperate. I know that most of the focus in the class is on how people fail to cooperate, but we want to spend the last couple of weeks talking about how this can also provide incentives for cooperation. As you can see in the readings, people talk about how these scarcities could be opportunities to try to work together towards a common good, but that's shaped by how many groups have to actually agree to negotiate, how they judge their short-term versus long-term goals, and how easy it is to enforce these kind of agreements. So there's a lot to cover in later weeks that link to this week, but I wanted to spend 1 week focused on water as a way to try to reinforce the links that this most basic kind of resource has on a lot of the outcomes that we care about in this class. So cheers to you guys, and I'll see you in the workshop.